Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again. In this video, we'll stop using mock data and actually add a real database to a project. I'll be using Postgres, so if you're not familiar with Postgres and you don't have Postgres installed on your computer, then go ahead and take the time to do that now and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've got everything set up. So I've got my pgadmin panel right here. I've got a database for this project I'm calling ts-gql, and I don't have any tables set up yet. We're going to, well actually I do, I just made myself a liar. Let me go ahead and drop that. Alright, so I have no table set up at this point, so we'll add a user table or a users table together in a few minutes. Also, make sure that you know which user which Postgres user you want to use for this project. I think there's a default user always called Postgres, but if you have other user or roles added to your Postgres, you can use those as well. And we'll be using those in our connection setup when we add our database. And if that doesn't make sense at this point, don't worry, we're going to go through this step by step. Okay, so in my package.json file, I've already added, you can see that I've already added a few packages we're going to need. All right, to use Postgres with Node, we'll use this package PG, which is just Postgres Node. And it's been around for a long time and people have been using it for years, so don't worry about adding this and then having some dependency that you think may not be usable in a year or two. It's a solid dependency and it's been around for a while. And since we're doing TypeScript, we'll need to add this @type/pg package as well, along with .env, so we can use a .env file to hide our connection variables. All right, so let's go to the Postgres Node documentation. And here on the part called connecting, we can get the basic stuff we're going to need to connect. Recall before, our data was in a file called mockdb.js, and it was just this simple array of two JSON objects. And we were displaying, or we were using that as basically our mock database and just displaying that on our GraphQL playground. And if you recall, your GraphQL playground is our proxy front end with which we can view all of our data through the browser. Let's go ahead and get that up and running just to refresh ourselves. Alright, so if you remember, this is the shape of the data that we had when we finished our last video. We're not going to quite get back to this today. We're going to set up a database and add some data to it, which won't look exactly like the data that we have now. Meaning it won't look exactly like this. And we'll probably won't get back to that until the next video. Meaning we won't be able to display everything that we want to display for a user, including the projects that they're involved with. So but for now, go ahead and comment this out, and eventually we'll just delete it. Right, so we'll want to bring in the PG package. We'll want to import that to this file. So from the connecting section, you can see they give you the import statement here. Go ahead and paste it in, and we won't be needing pool at this point. Alright, we'll also need, if you go down to the section that's titled programmatic, they've got this little bit of code here that we can use to set up our client. Let's go ahead and paste that in. Alright, so basically the user, the role that you chose for the database that you're using for this project, that'll go here. The database host, which is just going to be localhost for now, that'll go here. The database name you gave it, mine was, if you remember, ts-gql. And we'll go ahead and just call this localhost. All right, you don't want to put your password here. You want to keep that in a .env file. All right, and our port's going to be 5432. All right, that's the default port that Postgres usually uses. All right, so if you go into, well, if you don't have one, you should create one now. In the root of your project, create a .env file. If you go into that, this is where we set up our environment variables. Now, off screen, I'll go ahead and add my password and my username. But basically, you don't have to choose these exact names for your variables. These are what I'm using, but you can just use user, host name, and pass if you don't want to add the DB part. So for now, just let me add those in off screen. Okay, and also we're going to need the .env package so that we can bring those variables in. All right, so it should be available for use. I can check it real quick. So even though I have localhost written out here, I also have it stored in my variables just so I can test it. So the way you bring them in is with process.env and then the name that you gave it. You gave that particular variable. So in this case, it would be db host. Okay, and I can see down here that I'm bringing the value in just fine. So looks like our .env has been configured correctly and we can use it here. All right, so go ahead and set the appropriate values. And remember, these variable names that I'm using here, these are the ones that I chose. If you've chosen them differently, be sure to put them in according to how you chose them. All right, so we should be able to test and see if we are connected or not. So let's go ahead and export this client to another file. All right, and for now, we'll go ahead and export it to our index.ts file, which is our main file. But before we do that, let's go ahead and rename this file here. We're no longer using mock data, so let's call it just db.js. And go ahead and update your imports. So in your index.ts file, we can go ahead and bring our client in. There it is. And so if you go to the Postgres node documentation again and grab this right here. And let's paste it in right here. Okay, so you can see in our console down here that this response is coming in, right? And it shows us the value that we queried right now, right? Which is the time that it is right now. For you, it'll be a little bit different, of course. It'll be a lot different, probably. And so at least we know we've got a connection here by looking at that. So let's go ahead and create a table for our database. Now, since we were concerned in the last video and the video before primarily with users, we'll go ahead and create a table called users. All right, and we'll do that not in our index.ts file. In fact, we don't really want to be. Let's go ahead and just comment this out for now. Let's create another file, and we'll keep it at the same level as our index.ts file, and we'll call that utils, and we'll make it a TypeScript file. Excuse me. All right, and here's where we'll actually go ahead and make our queries. So we'll need to bring into this file our database client. Just like we did in the index.ts file. All right, so if you go back to the documentation for Postgres Node, actually not that documentation. There's an article on stack abuse that's pretty good. It gives you an introduction on how to integrate Postgres with Node. And they give you a lot of code for free here. So the first bit of code that we can borrow from them, and don't worry, I'll put this link in the description below the video. The first thing we can do is grab this little bit of code for creating a table. All right, but before we do that, we'll want to wrap it inside of a function. All right, and we'll just call that function create user table. All right, and then we'll go ahead and add that query that we just borrowed. And I realize that I'm not showing you my terminal. I apologize for that. So basically in my utils.ts file, I've added this function here, and we're going to use that to wrap our query and our logic for making the query. All right, but remember, if you recall, we had a schema that told us what our user should look like, at least in our data graph. It won't necessarily look like that in our database. So in your GraphQL folder, you had a schema.js file, right? So you had this user type, and the user had a name, an email, and a list of projects that he or she was associated with. Let's go ahead and add a little bit more to our user type. I'd like to add an ID, and we'll make that an integer. All right, and also we'd like to add a password, and that'll be a string. And for our project, we'll go ahead and add an ID as well. All right, but we're not going to focus on the project today. We're just going to focus on the user, or on the users table. All right, so our table should have an ID value or an ID column. It should have a name column, an email column, a password column. This we're not actually going to put into our database, right? This is going to be gotten in a different way. Right, we're going to create a table called projects as well, and we'll have to grab data from both tables and then combine them and put them in this shape here. But we're not going to do all of that in this video. In this video, we're just going to get a user with this basic information and display it in our GraphQL playground. Alright, so if we go back to our utils.ts file, right, we'll want to make sure that we have an ID, right, and that will be an integer, and it will also be a primary key. And our primary key is just going to be a unique field that makes sure that every user in our table has a unique ID. All right, and it's going to be the primary reference for that user. All right, so now that we've got our query defined, we'll want to go ahead and make a request to the database to create that table. Right, and we can do that with try catch. That way we can handle errors as well. It's going to be asynchronous, so we'll be using async await. And then we'll want to make sure that we have our table created. So we'll at least send ourselves a message. And then of course if we get an error, we'll want to log that. Alright, and then if we create the new table, we'll want to go ahead and just cut the connection for now. So we can say client.end. Alright, and just to make sure that we have a table, or that we've created one, we can create a function for ourselves that gets a list of all of the tables. Right, and if you want to know what that query looks like, our good friend Flavio Copez has that right here for us, so you can just copy that. And okay, of course I'll link to this page in the description below the video. You can go ahead and define a query. Alright, and it's the same thing. Just define a try catch. And we'll just take a look at the response. There. Okay. So we're exporting both of these functions, which, sorry, we should finish writing this function. And don't worry about closing the connection here for now. So we're exporting both of these functions, and if we want to call them, we can just go ahead and call them from the index.ts file. Alright, so we'll need the create user table function and also the list tables function. And just to make sure. Alright, so there's one thing we forgot to do here. We forgot to connect the client. That means, or that should make it so that it works now. Alright, so let's try to first run our create tables function, or create user table function. Alright, and it says here that our table has been created successfully. And if we want to verify that, we can go ahead and run our list tables function. Alright, so looks like we have our users table inserted. And then of course you can always just go to your PG admin page and check your tables. Right, you've got your users table. You can use view edit data to take a look at all the rows, and it has the columns. That's what I meant, all the columns. It has all of the columns that we wanted to add, except for it has age here, and I'm not quite sure why. We pasted something in and we didn't adjust it to look like we wanted it to look. I'm sorry about that. So let's go ahead and go back to our code. Alright, yeah, and I carelessly pasted everything in here, and it's not at all in the shape that we wanted it to be. So name, varchar, email stays, last name stays, age doesn't stay. Actually, sorry, the name stays, but the first name, last name, and age don't stay. We'll want the password, which is also varchar. And was there anything else? I think that was it. All right, remember, ID, name, email, password. So it's these four things. We weren't going to put the projects into the database under users, so that's good. Alright, so let's go ahead and fix this mistake. Well, first of all, let's go back to our index.js file. Stop running that function. Go ahead and drop your users table. Alright, and then let's go ahead and create the user table one more time. And before we do that, we don't need to look at the whole response here. We just need to look at the rows. If you recall what the shape of the response looked like, you had this array of rows, right? And the first row was just the first table. So that's all we need to see here. And I realize again, you're not looking at the editor. Sorry about that. So what I did was I just changed my list tables function a little bit. We're not logging the entire result to the console, just the rows, right? And if you looked at the response that we got earlier, right, there was an array of rows here that gave you the table names. Okay, so in your index.ts file, go ahead and run your create user table function. And we got an error here. Let's go back and take a look at the way we've set up our create user table query. I just forgot to add a comma here. Isn't that? Yeah, it says syntax error at or near email. Right, so this is near email right here, so we add that. Okay, and it says table has been created successfully. We can list our tables. Okay, and we see we've got a table called users. And then of course if we go over to our PG admin panel and refresh, we can see we've got our users table, and it has the columns that we wanted, right? Name, email, password, and ID as the primary key. Good. All right, so let's go ahead now and add some users to this table. So in our utils file, we can create a function, and we'll call it add user. All right, and we'll need a query as usual. All right, so if we go to the Postgres node documentation, they show you how to set up an add query or an insert, how to add some data to the database or add a row. Basically, we can use this right here. All right, so we are inserting into users name, email. We also want to insert ID, and a password. All right, and then here in this little values section, this $1, $2, these are just placeholders. All right, they're kind of like a variable, like if you have think of like a variable as a box where you can insert different values into it. That's what these are doing. All right, and then the values that we want to insert are number one, the ID, right? And the second value would be the name. The third value would be the email, and the fourth value would be the password. All right, but we need to bring these into the function here as parameters. So the first will be ID. Now, TypeScript is going to force you to declare a type here. So ID, as you recall, is an integer. So in JavaScript, we'll just call it a number. All right, the name, and that was a string. The email, which was also a string, and the password, which was also a string. Okay, so now we have our variables passed in, and we can use them here in our little values array. And then we can try to add our data to the database. So we'll use a try catch again. Alright, so that hopefully that'll return the rows to us. The rows meaning each row of the table of users, which each row will represent an individual user. Alright, and then we'll go ahead and close the connection. You'll see that sometimes I'm taking going to great lengths to keep adding in the semicolons, and I'm doing that because I've been asked at work to not omit semicolons anymore, so I'm trying to get back in the habit of putting them in. Okay, so it looks like our add user function is good, so we just need to import it into, say, our index.ts file. And use it there. So we'll go ahead and choose just the first user to have an ID of 1. Remember our user, Octavio Flores. We had an email of oflores@zcorp.com. Give him a password of ABC123. Alright, so let's see if we can add that user to the database now. Alright, so we got a response here, and it returned an empty array, so apparently we're not going to get the user back. It's just going to display an empty row. It's going to display what was in there before we added the user, but if we go over to our database and take a look, hopefully we'll see our user in there. So go ahead and refresh everything. And we do. We see our user has been put in. Okay, and we can create a function to get the users, to look at all the users, which we're going to need anyway. So let's go ahead and create a basic function for doing that. And for now, we'll just call it get users. What am I console logging here? So what happened is I left this going and it tried to add it again. So, but because we're using our primary key to guarantee uniqueness of user IDs, it won't let us do that. So anyway, let's add a function. We'll call it get users. I'm really tired tonight. Keep forgetting things. Alright, and this will be a simple query. We just want to get all the rows in the users table. So we'll select all of them from the table users. And that should be good. And we'll just select rows again because all we want to see are the rows of the table. Okay, so let's go ahead and call this from the index.ts file. Alright, so that returns our users, and we can see that here in the console. So you can see that the the rows that we get back, it's an array of objects, right, where each object represents a user. Okay, so at this point, we don't have, as I said, the list of projects that the individual user is involved with, and we're not going to do that in this video. But let's add at least one more user, the same user that we had other than Octavio in our first couple of videos, and that was Farah. So I'll go back to, or actually we can just call it from here. Add user, we'll give her an ID of 2. Okay, so hopefully this will let us add her to it. There's no reason why it shouldn't. But we got an error, so let's take a look at that. And so it just closed our connection. Go ahead and stop that for now. So it says now that it tried to add a user and there was a duplicate key. So that means it probably did add her the first time, and then it tried to add her again when we just updated our code. Let's go ahead and take a look at our database. And actually, I'll just go ahead and comment that out so it doesn't keep trying to add the same user. Alright, but it did add her, so that was successful. Alright, and don't worry about our logic at this point. We'll clean it up later. We just kind of want to get a couple of users in the database and then send them through our resolver and to our GraphQL playground. Okay, so we've been calling these functions from utils.ts, but we actually want to call this getUsers function from our resolver. Right, so if you go into your resolver file, right, remember we were importing this users, which was something different. Right, so for now, and we're not importing anymore from the database, right? We need to import from the utils.ts file. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. Try that one more time. Okay, and we'll use getUsers. And then we should just be able to return that here. Okay, so our server is running without any errors right now. So if we go to our playground, and let's just add the query as it is, or our updated query. Alright, so remember, if we just try to run our query now, it's going to give us an error, right? Because there's a selection of subfields that we have to worry about. That's namely at least the name or the email or something. We certainly don't want to return the password. So let's just go ahead and put in the ID, the name, and the email. Good. And that should return the 2 users to us. This query should. And it doesn't. So what are we doing wrong here? So let's go back to our code. All right, and this is just a simple problem here. Rather than console logging and checking out the result, we need to return it. So just return. All right, so remember, this is an array of objects, right? And then each object in the array has the name, email, password, ID properties. So let's just go ahead and try to see if things work with this simple return statement here. Good, and it does. All right, so we've done what we set out to do, or at least partly what we set out to do, and that was to stop using mock data and actually use real data from a database. We don't have things exactly as they were in the last video. We don't have that list of projects that a user is attached to, and in the next video we'll tackle that problem. But for now, thanks as always for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.